You're listening to episode 89 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the podcast and website for modern, secular application of early Buddhist thought. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the companion website has show notes for each episode, along with resource materials on Buddhism, critical thinking, science, secularism, and skeptical thought. Though the podcast focuses on core practice from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Ken McLeod speaks with us today about humanity in institutions and his organization, Unfettered Mind. Hi everyone. Glad you're here, particularly for this episode. There have been some very positive things happening recently, including the podcast having over 100,000 downloads, and our Halloween episode last week with our friend David Chapman being referenced in an online article for Tricycle magazine. There is another development I'd like to share with you all, something you may not have noticed if you subscribe to the podcast via iTunes or an RSS feed. As I've been mentioning now and then, there has been a clear message from many of you listeners of the podcast and readers on the Facebook fan page that community building is very important to our practice and understanding. The original website, thesecularbuddhist.com, was only designed to be support for the podcast and has grown into much more, but still isn't set up to meet some of our ongoing needs for consistency of the meaning of secular Buddhism, continuity and connectedness of our various communities, and support for the development needs of secular Buddhist teachers and leaders. I'm pleased to announce that, starting with this episode, there is a new site which has been designed to meet those needs and more as time goes on. The link on the Facebook page for this episode goes to the new site, secularbuddhistassociation.com. Next week, we'll have an episode devoted specifically to the new site's features, which include commenting directly on the episode page, an online discussion forum, and of course the resources so many of you have found of value. And I'm very pleased to have Ken McLeod as our guest today, as he is uniquely qualified to speak to the challenges we face regarding our growing secular Buddhist community as we navigate the obstacles of institution. Ken is a management consultant and executive coach who combines an extensive background in Eastern thought and philosophy with practical experience in applying these principles in American culture. He has a graduate degree in mathematics from the University of British Columbia, more than 20 years intensive training in Buddhism, and over 20 years teaching and consulting experience. Ken has successfully pioneered innovative approaches to teaching Eastern methods of attention and awareness through his organization, Unfettered Mind, which he established in 1990. In 1999, Ken established a consulting practice focusing on executive coaching, team building, and personal and organizational effectiveness. His particular focus is on the use of systems thinking to create organizational dynamics that naturally generate productive interactions within the organization. So, sit back, relax, and have a nice herbal tea, something with mint. And my guest today is Ken McLeod. Ken, thank you for being here.
You're very welcome. It's a pleasure.
And I'll have to tell the audience it's a pleasure a second time because we did an awesome interview that the recording devices, both of them, didn't get. So Ken is being very kind and generous with his time and doing it again a couple of days later. So we're not going to tread the same ground, however. We're going to take a step off a bit from where we were before. And Ken, what I'd like to do is for us to just chat very briefly about some of your experiences in the Tibetan practice? Not the full background, but just some for the audience.
My involvement with Buddhism, I guess, was grew out of some kind of relatively inarticulate spiritual yearning, uh, which I can trace back probably to my early teens, but it didn't really gain any force until I found myself in Tehran, in the middle of traveling overland in the early 70s, wondering what the hell am I doing there? And I'm not quite sure. I'd read a little bit in Zen before, but I'd read, not practiced. And so I eventually found my way to Kala Rinpoche in the Darjeeling area of India, and for complex reasons, which I can now see were a combination of spiritual and psychological factors. Started studying and practicing Tibetan Buddhism quite seriously. Led me to become his translator for his first two North American tours, and ended up in the first three-year retreat for Westerners in 1976, in which we received complete transmissions in the Karma Kagyu and the Shangpa Kagyu traditions. I ended up doing 2 3-year retreats, the second one to avoid being sent to a center to teach. But I had a very, very difficult time. Some old emotional blocks came out and made me extremely sick, both physically and mentally, or emotionally. And there is no way I could continue in the retreat environment after that. Rinpoche, in his wisdom, sent me to Los Angeles, where I taught, even though it was contrary to Rinpoche's own wishes. I taught what I felt was useful to people, and I suppose that's where I started on pragmatic Buddhism. After Rinpoche died in 1989, I then set up my own non-profit called Unfettered Mind, with the tagline of pragmatic Buddhism, and developed what could be called a private practice model, and gradually let go of any formal relationship with the institutions of Tibetan Buddhism, and very slowly recovered from the difficulties I experienced in the retreat. That took about 20 years, actually, which is, some people find a disturbingly long time, but that's the way things go.
It takes as long as it takes.
Yeah. It takes as long as it takes, yeah. And all of that is, I very much appreciate the depth and power of the Tibetan tradition. The methods are quite extraordinary and very effective. They're also very limited in the sense that Tibetan society was a medieval society. And it took me quite a long time to sort of free myself from, because I was so deeply immersed in it, to free myself from the restrictions of that kind of thinking. I had people here in Los Angeles who were really very, very helpful with that in a kind and gentle way. And then I began to see things very, very differently. That's basically, I mean, that expanded out into becoming a business consultant, of all things. I think it would be worthwhile possibly talking about that transition, because it's a very difficult one. And I've also worked with probably a dozen long-term practitioners who've had to make the same transition, and it's very, very difficult.
In fact, let's talk about that. I want to paint a little bit of a picture to what you were just touching on, is the difference between our Western society and what you and I had chatted about before with Peter Drucker, and the three revolutions that have taken place in Western society but haven't taken place from the Tibetan perspective. And that was something of a realization that the differences between those two societies has a very significant impact when you're a Westerner finding yourself in a different place. So tell us a bit about the three revolutions that Drucker had articulated.
Drucker, in his book Post-Capitalist Society, talks about, and I think he refers to them in some of his other writing as well. In the late 17th, mainly in the 18th century, particularly in Britain, you had the Industrial Revolution. Now, one of the significances of the Industrial Revolution is that it allowed or enabled any amount of energy to be applied to a task. So the amount of work you could get done was suddenly way more than the manpower. With the steam engine, principally. And this was, of course, powered by burning fossil fuels, coal, in Britain's case. And in the late 19th, early 20th century, there was what Drucker calls the productivity revolution. And in this revolution, and Taylor's work on time studies, was pivotal, was key here. By reducing what were formerly crafts to simple, repeatable tasks, many of which could be automated. Now, you not only could apply energy to work, you could also, you didn't have to do that long apprenticeship, and you could just set up an assembly line and start manufacturing things. And I mean, I think when we talked before, I gave the example of the croissant.
Yes. Again, that was a great example.
Well, 20 years ago, or maybe 25, it was very difficult to get a good croissant in America. It's a real specialty. And some American entrepreneurs went over to France, observed and measured exactly how they made good croissants, what the temperature of the butter should be, what the temperature of the flour, what the proportion should be, how it needed to be rolled, how many times it needed to be rolled, etc. And adjusting for humidity and temperature and all of this stuff. Came back and automated the whole damn thing, and just churned out perfect croissants. And so now they're everywhere. And it's a very good example of how a craft was reduced to a simple, relatively simple manufacturing process. And this just increases productivity manyfold. And one of Drucker's arguments is that the wealth of societies is primarily, well, this is basic economic theory, really, it's not just Drucker, that the wealth of a society is based on its productivity. He goes further. He says the relative equality of income is based on productivity too, and he attributes the increasing inequality of income to the fact that America has stopped increasing its productivity in the last couple of decades, at a much lower rate anyway than in the 50s and 60s, which is when that was the affluent society. Third revolution is the managerial revolution, in which understanding of work processes began to develop, and then designing work processes that worked better. Now, to my mind, given some of my business consulting, there are plenty of businesses out there that never heard of this revolution.
Right. Yeah, they're missing that.
Yeah, but the smarter companies, and particularly those companies who are deal with what Drucker calls knowledge. I mean, things like Google and the Microsoft, Apple, Cisco, a lot, where you're managing very significant, if not the main thing you're doing is managing information and knowledge. IBM, for instance, turned itself from a company which manufactured computers to a service company which does consulting, where it can provide its managerial expertise to a large number of businesses. This again has resulted in a massive increase in productivity, but not only has each of these revolutions increased productivity, it has led to complete restructuring of society and of who is powerful, who is influential, what is valued. Before the craftsperson was valued, and then the manufacturer is valued, and now it's the systems thinker that's valued, and so forth. And they're I won't go into all the details, but they're very, very far-reaching changes in the society. So we call ourselves a post-industrial society, but we're a post-industrial or a post-productivity or a post-managerial society. And Tibet, which is basically a medieval society, many parts of which were still nomadic, actually. I was going to say a cut above nomads, but they weren't. They were actually nomadic. Well, they haven't gone through any of these three revolutions. And the extent of the stability of Tibetan society is extraordinary. It is far easier. I mean, there's absolutely no problem for me to read a book in Tibetan that was written 1,200 years ago. I pick it up, I can read it as just as easily as I could pick up a book that was written 100 years ago, or one, as long as it's in the Dharma, because I'm not good at secular vocabulary, 50 years ago. But give me a book that was written in English, or what passed for English, 300 or 400 years ago, it's going to be challenging. I'm thinking of Shakespeare, say, which I guess it's about 400 years ago. Shakespeare in the original is actually not straightforward. If you go back 800 years, now you're talking about really medieval English and getting close to Chaucer, and go a bit further back here into the Faerie Queene and Spenser. Those are really, really hard books to read. I mean, it's really another language. So the language has changed, and that's just one instance of what I'm talking about. So people say, well, why can't we just practice the way that we practiced in those societies? Well, we can't, because our situations are very different. And there's another thing which someone told me about very recently, which I found just fascinating. There's a economist in the mid-60s, Edward Baumol, Baumol, who wrote a paper in 1967, which I actually have a reference to it here if your readers or listeners are interested. But it's and it goes like this. 200 years ago, which would put us approximately at the time of Mozart. Let's see, that'd be early 19th century. Well, I think Mozart was about then. But so you had 5 violinists, or you've had a violin quartet. So you had 2 violins, a viola, and a cellist. And they're going to play a quartet. Okay, now it takes them a certain amount of time to play a quartet. Meanwhile, you have 4, let's say, blacksmiths making horseshoes. They can make a certain number of horseshoes, or let's make it even simpler. They're making nails, okay? And they don't have machines to make nails, or barely at that point. So they're making nails. Well, those 4 people making nails can make a certain number of nails in whatever time it takes for those people to play. Let's say it's half an hour to play their piece of music, okay? Or let's say make it a long piece of music. Say it's an hour. fast forward 200 years. How long does it take those now those four people running a machine in a steel company? How many nails can they make in an hour now? I mean, it's astronomically more,
Astronomical.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. How many quartets can those four people play in an hour?
Same amount.
Same amount. So what you have here is that a huge increase in productivity in one area and no increase in productivity in another area. What that does economically is it makes nails cheaper and quartets more expensive. And when you this is what is behind the rising costs of medical healthcare, because you can't increase productivity that much. You can do it some, but nothing like you can as in the manufacturing process, because you're dealing with really different processes. But you apply this to Buddhism, it gets very interesting. You can't increase productivity in Buddhism very much either. And the result of that is that it becomes progressively, the higher the standard of living in a society because of the increases in productivity, it becomes progressively more not only to practice Buddhism, but to support teachers, to train them, etc., because you cannot raise the productivity. And so when people for an attorney these days to go on a 10-day retreat, it costs them about $30,000 to $40,000 in terms of lost income. And people think, well, they earn so much money. Yeah, but they also, it costs them a lot.
Lose a lot.
Particularly,
Yeah.
particularly if they're a solo practitioner, But so these make it very, I just bring that out as a very specific example of why our circumstances are different. It was much easier, much cheaper to be a renunciate. And nobody thinks of renunciates in economic terms in Buddhist time, because, you either hacked for a living in the field, or a few people just gave you some stuff and that was enough to live on, and that's all you needed. But that doesn't work this way. I mean, and I found this when I came to Los Angeles. There I was. And in order to be able to work as a teacher, this is back in the mid 80s, I had to figure out how to generate a monthly income of $2,000, which translates into $25,000. That's not a large income, even by standards of 1980. But that was the very minimum. Whereas if I had been sent to a village in, Vietnam or the Philippines or something like that, I wouldn't have had to. It would have been very straightforward, because people would have just given me a place to live in grass hut or something, and given me some of their food. I could have started teaching. It was simple, but not possible here.
Yeah, we have a very different cultural makeup, and our society operates in an entirely different way. And it's not a value judgment in that. It is simple a fact of the way our interactions go.
Yeah, it's very different. And the challenge that I face with people, and I saw this at the Buddhist Gate conference, because people aren't talking about it in these terms, but I think it might be helpful to, because it is so expensive to practice. It's expensive to take an hour. If you're a professional and you take an hour to practice, that's expensive. And I'm going to use a doctor or an attorney. So their time is worth a few $100s an hour in today's culture. Well, that's how much they're spending, or not. That's how much their practice time is costing them. And it's even worse for someone who works at McDonald's or something like that, because they have a limited amount of time that they can work, usually 8 hours or less. Even if it's 10, and the proportion of income that they put into that they need just to survive Well, that goes straight. If they're practicing any significant amount, they're taking potentially taking a hit right there, and it's a much larger percentage of their income than for, say, a doctor or a professional. And so I think it's that economic, or I think it's one factor behind why people are saying, do I have to put all this time into practice, and is there any shortcut, etc., is an unspoken economic pressure.
We're lacking diversity in our Western communities, and these seem to fall along socioeconomic lines to some degree, because we have people who have the ability to devote time to the practice. What we're not seeing is a great deal of a socioeconomic representation of the giving society that we're in. We don't have that yet in the West.
What do you see missing?
Well, what I see missing is I've had a number of interviews with people on diversity in our sanghas, and we typically focused on racial diversity.
Mm-hmm.
And these seem to have fallen along socioeconomic lines more so than just the racial diversity by itself.
Well, that would fit with the economic argument I'm making, wouldn't
Mm-hmm.
it?
Yes, precisely. Now, one of the things I did want us to talk about is, and this will tie in a bit to your experiences at Garrison Institute, is the challenges that we have and some of the things we need to look at as risks with institutionalization. Tell us some about that.
Well, this is a huge topic, of course, Ted.
Yeah, yes, it is.
um, I'm going to start in a slightly different place. And if people reading or listening to this are interested, they can look up on my blog at Musings by Ken at Blogspot. My first blog post was a conversation with Warren Bennis, and it was on this topic. Warren Bennis is the person who basically developed leadership studies. And I've, being the iconoclast that I am, always found all of the talk about leadership immensely irritating. And it took me a little while to figure out why I was irritated. Now, this is just my own idea. I don't know whether there's any substance to it. But I came to the conclusion that it is the emphasis on leadership is based on the millennial myth and the secularization of the Christian myth of salvation, and I can go into those topics to explain the connections there.
It would be good to read, yes.
Yeah, but basically, the myth is that if we had the right leaders, then our organizations would function in a way that was good for everybody. And this is a complete and utter myth. Because organizations need to make changes, and when they need to make changes, they get rid of people, and it's really damaging for those people when they lose their jobs and plants are downsized and so forth and so forth. And there's very little way to avoid that. But I thought that I think that the focus on leadership is a deflection away from what I think is a more important question, and that is, how do we live as an individual in a society that is populated by systems and organizations without succumbing to the mindset of the organizations? And I think for spiritual practitioners, this is a really, really important question. And so from my business consulting, but not only just from that, from what I've seen in, what's heavily organized, the Tibetan tradition, is that when you're part of an organization, there are a lot of forces that are restricting and preventing you from thinking and seeing what's right in front of you. And you get a mindset. And to me, this is the antithesis of freedom that we arguably are working towards in spiritual practice. So I have a very some concern about that. And at the same time, in a society that works the way our society does, with the number of people that we have, it's absolutely essential to have organization systems. It's not possible for us to return to the village. It just wouldn't work.
Right. We're not of that size. We can't.
Yeah. And one of my favorite quotes on this is from, well, I'll read it first, and then let everybody think about it for a moment, and then, because the source is a little surprising. I only ever cared about the man. I never gave a fig for the ideologies unless they were mad or evil. I never saw institutions as being worthy of their parts, or policies as much other than excuses for not feeling. And just a parenthesis by me, I see that, and that's why in my own organization, I've tried to avoid policies and actually deal with people as people in every case. I believe that almost any political system operated with humanity can work. And the most benign of systems without humanity is vile. Those are two really extraordinary statements if you think about them.
Very significant.
The trick, I suppose, is to find the system that gives the least leeway to the rogues. And mind you, the rogues are always looking for ways to corrupt the system so they can have more leeway. The guarantee of our virtue is our compassion. And if you allow this institution or any other to steal your compassion away, wait and see what you become. The man is everything. And if your calling is anything, you will always prefer him to the collective, because the collective is humanity's lowest. And the collective is most often spoken for by people who are nothing without it. I guess where that comes from.
Oh boy, putting me on the spot.
Well, it was written by John le Carré, who is a member of the British Secret Service, and he puts it in the mouth of one of his main characters, George Smiley, on the occasion of his retirement from the British Secret Service. And I just found that, I was listening to this on books on tape in my car, and I heard this, and I went, wow. And it just, I thought it was such a wonderful statement of what is essential. It doesn't matter what institution. And if this can be said of a Secret Service, how much more so than of corporations and churches and Dharma centers and what have you. So this is one of my favorite quotes, and it's something I seek to keep in mind on a personal level all the time, because you have these systems, these institutions, but they encourage you and lead you to behave in ways that are inhuman. And the challenge, I think, for us is not to find the right leaders, but to find ways that we retain our humanity or even develop our humanity within the context of our lives, which take place largely for most people in one or more institutions. And you're also putting me in mind a talk that I heard just a couple of months ago by the imam of the mosque that's in downtown Manhattan, close to the World Trade Center. I can't remember his name. But he gave a talk out at UCLA. And I'd read enough about this person that I really wanted to hear him. And I was very impressed. He was unabashedly religious in that he started off his talk with an invocation of Allah in Arabic, and would frequently quote prayers and the Quran in his talk, but not in any kind of proselytizing. This was just his vocabulary. And in the question and answer period that followed, there were two things that came out which I really deeply impressed me. One was somebody posed a question. Well, you've talked about God, and this seems to be very important to you. What about us atheists and agnostics? And his response was, then we need to talk about religion with a small r. That is, if you're atheist or agnostic, you still have certain values which you use to guide you in your life. And I have certain values that guide me in my life. So let's have a discussion about those values. And I just thought, wow, that just cuts through the whole thing right there. And the other thing that he said, which reminded me of something I read in Leo Strauss, amazingly enough, because he said, you keep talking about God. Why is this important? And he paused, and then he said, when you have an experience of God, or when you experience God, I can't remember exactly how he posed it, then it recalibrates your whole being so that you appreciate and honor the dignity of what it is to be human. And Leo Strauss says almost exactly the same thing in one of his books, which leads me to believe that Leo Strauss had some kind of faith or practice in him, because I'm not sure how it could have been written otherwise. But I think in that one's expressing something very, very deep about any spiritual tradition. I don't know. How does it strike you?
I'm resonating in particular with the concepts that we need to maintain our compassion as we have this inevitable growing of our communities and organizations that's going to happen. We really need to have that as the processes, because of our size, increasing complexity. What I've been struggling with in the formulation and the supporting of that growing of community is avoiding the things that I've found to be challenging in institutionalizing them, that are more negative. And what the quotes that you've been bringing up are, to me, more in keeping with what is going to be beneficial in Buddhist practice to maintain that continuity of our compassion, our care for others. How we formulate that in our growing of community, that's something I'm still challenged by. Because it's one thing to say we should behave as we want others to behave towards us. It's another thing to put that into practice, and how to foster that and see that with community growth. I'm not quite sure how that's going to be done. I've yet to see some very, very mind-blowing formulations of that, but I might not have found them yet.
Well, you're going to bring out the cynic in me now after the iconoclast.
It was rather prompting for the let's move on to Garrison, because there were some things that...
let's go there in a moment, okay?
All right, yep.
Because the thing that you put me in mind of, I'm not sure whether he's still alive, probably not. There's a Afghan by the name of Idris Shah, S-H-A-H, who wrote a lot of books. And he was a Sufi, lived in London, in England, for many, many years, most of his life, I think, and wrote very extensively, trying to dispel misconceptions about Sufism and religious and spiritual practice in general. But one of the points that he makes over and over again, particularly in two of his books, Knowing How to Know and Learning How to Learn, is that spiritual communities inevitably evolve into social communities. And I came across there's a YouTube, if you look up Lifeboat Story, I think, on YouTube, and I'll can locate the link. There's a Christian minister who gives this example of this lifeboat unit, which people come together to and man a lifeboat and go out and rescue people. But after a while, they attract so much attention and money and donations, things like that, they become a social club, and they forget about lifeboating. And so another group does the same thing. So this stretch of seaway becomes littered with all of these social clubs, all of which used to be lifeboaters. And it's a completely different source, but they're saying exactly the same thing. So there is something about, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier, that an organization constrains and encourages people to think and act and see certain things and ignore other things. And that's what leads to their imbalance. And it doesn't matter whether it's a religious institution, a corporation, a non-profit, a government. It's a dynamic that takes place in all organizations. And going back to Le Carre's quote, there's a dehumanizing quality in that. What I found when I teach retreats, even if it's in like a 10-day or a 3-week retreat, I have to be alert to that aspect of things. Even when people are in silence, that tendency starts to exert itself. And from what Idris Shah says, the only solution is to break up those groups and start a new group. Or start with a new configuration. And what happens then is that the people who want it for social connection get frustrated because their connections keep being broken up. But the people who are there for spiritual practice, that doesn't bother them because that's what they're there for.
Yeah, they're fine. There's a sincerity in their intent.
Well, yes, but it being broken up and then starting with a new group of people, well, they're still doing their spiritual practice. There's been no interruption, but there has been an interruption for people who are trying to use it or use that spiritual setting for their relationship needs and so forth. And that's where that's where the tension comes up. I don't want to say corruption because it really is something very natural to humans. We're social creatures, so we form these social relationships, but they actually do undermine the spiritual intent in many cases. And so one has to, and many people find that a very controversial thing to say, but so what?
Yeah, it's just a natural recognition of what occurs in groups.
Yes, yeah. So, and there's another thing, and then we can go to Garrison, that occurs in groups all the time. For some reason, this is called the small group phenomenon, even though it's in no way restricted to small groups. And that is, in a group that stays together for any length of time, and a length of time, I'm probably speaking at least a year or so, will inevitably split into two groups or two subgroups. Because as the group, as time passes, the conditions both within the group and around the group change. And there are people who say, okay, we need to adapt to these changes. And there are other people who say, no, we need to do what we originally, what we started with. That's why we got together, and we need to just stay with that. And so over time, the liberal, the progressives and the conservatives develop. And it doesn't matter. I've seen this so many times, and it's well known sociologically. And how groups handle that tension is crucial to their success. Both are important. And as Stephen Batchelor points out, one either is an extreme and a dead end as such. The creativity comes in holding those tensions so that people the people who are trying to hold things back and keep some kind of continuity and not just change everything are contributing one thing, and the people who are saying, no, we need to make changes and this needs to happen, are helping the group adapt to things. But it's the real creativity comes by holding those two together and working with it. And then quite wonderful things can happen. But that can be really difficult. And many groups have split up over it happened in Buddhism. It's basically the difference between the Mahayana and the Theravada. I'm not saying the Hinayana, because the Mahayanists invented the Hinayana so they could beat somebody up.
Yeah.
But there were those who sought to preserve things as they had received them, and then there are others who wanted to adapt to the development of money, the development of a trading class, etc. All of these changes that were taking place in Indian society, and that contributed to the development of what became known as Mahayana Buddhism. So now we can go to Garrison. What do you want to know there?
Good old Garrison. Well, as the listeners may or may not be aware, there was a recent Teachers Council, the Mahasangha, I think it was referred to, at the Garrison Institute in New York. And at this collection of teachers certainly across the country, and I believe several countries, representations, there were a lot of different generations, attitudes, and for you in particular, some ideas that were perhaps not as well received as they may have been by some of the others. And you were seeing some trends that were not very comfortable and were perhaps a bit concerning to you. I'm trying to be diplomatic here. Tell us about some of those trends that you've noticed.
The large conference, there were actually two conferences. The first conference was with a group of 60 people. There were 20 what were called pioneers, though I think we preferred being called senior teachers. These were, I think, in this particular gathering, I think pretty well everybody was Westerner, but had been practicing or teaching in the West for most of them were 20 plus years, usually 30 plus years, but a minimum 20 plus. And they were basically people in my generation, in late 50s, early 60s, some older than that. Coming from the 1960s, basically, when Buddhism really started to grow, and it had survived, which not everybody did. And then there were 40 people in what were called the next generation, and these were teachers. Most of them had a fair amount of experience, but they were under 45. That was the cutoff. And so we had 2 or 3 day conference, which was okay. And then in addition to those 60, another 160 odd people arrived. So now we're up to over 200 people. And this is America was by far the most represented country, but there were people from Europe and other countries. Relatively few Asian people per se. A couple of people from Soko Gakkai, which is one of the largest Buddhist groups in North America. But there were 2. There may have been 3. I think there was one from England there. But Zen, Vajrayana, and Tibetan Buddha and Theravada, Zen, Theravadan, and Tibetan Buddhism are all heavily represented. And this is what Jack styled as a Mahasangha. But that conference in the opening night, it was framed entirely as Buddhism as a social institution, which I found utterly dismaying, because my own approach to teaching I've never taken that point of view. I don't want to be too sound too pretentious here, but I've just focused on the practice aspect and have avoided developing an institution because I didn't want the institutional issues and challenges, the ones that you naturally have to deal with when you deal with an institution, to draw energy away from practice. And one of the principles that I use with Unfettered Mind and the people who volunteer in helping Unfettered Mind in various ways is that their work, what they do for Unfettered Mind and help, cannot unbalance their practice. And if their practice is going down the tubes, then they have to stop doing volunteer work and return to their practice. Which it doesn't help Unfettered Mind grow, but it does keep people practicing. And I'm perfectly okay with that. But all of the content, virtually everything that was discussed in the plenary sessions were about various social issues and what should Buddhism do about them, and how do we grow Buddhism, etc., etc. And I just found all of this, and what should Buddhism be doing about this, and what stand should Buddhism taking here, etc., and all of these different things. And this just made me very uncomfortable for a lot of reasons. I don't think the actual topic of teaching was ever really discussed in any of the plenary sessions, which I thought was like, well, okay, here's a conference of Buddhist teachers, and we're not talking about teaching.
How does that work?
But I came to appreciate, and I wrote this to somebody afterwards, I think we need to change the terminology, because at that conference, yeah, there were a lot of people there who were teaching Buddhism, but you also had people there who were really in a rabbi role with respect to their groups, or a minister role. So we have Buddhist ministers. There were people there who are really comparable to theologians. That is, they studied not the practice of Buddhism, but how is Buddhism, you might say the theory of Buddhism. Stephen Batchelor sometimes refers to himself as a Buddhist theologian. But there were several people like that. You had a large number of Buddhist clinicians, that is, people who are using Buddhist principles to do clinical work with people, whether it's in the prison system or in mental health situations and so forth. But they're clinicians. So you have ministers, clinicians, teachers. You also had a number of very, very deeply learned scholars, not people who practiced particularly, but who had tremendous depth of learning from their scholastic endeavors, and their observations and knowledge were very valuable. So I think one of the things we need to move away from is the idea of, we use the term teacher in Buddhism, but it's actually broadened out. There are many, many different things going on, and maybe we should start naming them for what they are, rather than using this one term teacher to cover what are really very, very different activities. Because, and I think that would help a lot. There was a lot of emphasis and talk about diversity, and I had a wonderful conversation with one teacher from a minority community. Because I just asked her, why is this such a concern? And she told me very, very candidly what her feelings were about that. And that was a really lovely conversation. But afterwards, I thought, there's something problematic here. And the way I formulated it to myself is that when you emphasize diversity, you actually reinforce identity. And I think, and I remember a conversation I had with a student woman very early when I first started doing one-on-one consultations. I can actually see this conversation clearly in my mind's eye. But she was giving me quite a hard time about, how does a woman practice Dharma? How does woman practice Buddhism? And what as a man can you tell me about how a woman can practice Buddhism? And eventually I just looked at her and said, "You're not a woman." And she just looked at me and said, "What?" I said, "You're not a woman." And she just couldn't believe what she was hearing. And her temper started to rise, and I just let that rise for a little bit. And then I said very quietly, "And I'm not a man." And then she got curious, said, "What are you saying?" I said, "It's more accurate from a Buddhist perspective to say, you experience being a woman, and I experience being a man. But that doesn't make me a man, and it doesn't make you a woman. What we are is different from who we are. And in Buddhism, we're concerned with what we are, not who we are." And I think that's really important. I don't
Yes,
know, maybe you have some thoughts about it.
that shift in perspective is critical because we keep to frame it in some more traditional terminology, which is just the language that I'm accustomed to, is that we attach very much with this sense of identity and self, and that those narratives, questioning those and maybe setting those aside and looking at us in a different light, not necessarily as a man, a woman, a member of a particular ethnic group, or having a particularly ideological stance, but seeing that really there's an ongoing process and engagement that is what makes us up. And being more aware of that frees us from many mental boxes we otherwise carry around with us and are not even aware of.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. So one of the things I just didn't find that kind of conversation taking place at Garrison. Now I may have missed it because I'm not the most social of people, but the people I've talked to at Garrison said that most of them didn't find the plenary sessions very helpful or interesting. What they did find interesting were the side conversations and the small group conversations. But I've been to other conferences, notably the Buddhist Geese conference, about 3 or 4 weeks later, in which everything worked. The plenary sessions were lively and stimulating and thought-provoking, and the breakout sessions and small and side conversations, etc., were also very fulfilling and very enjoyable. I mean, everybody had a blast at that. So I think that there's another aspect that I picked up at Garrison, and that was that there seemed to be an underlying assumption that the Buddhist community was broken and needed healing. And I just reject that as a starting point because it's not my experience. It's going through growing pains as anything it would, but it's actually growing very well. It's vital. It's healthy. And the fastest way to break a community is to treat it as being broken.
Yeah, people are, I think, a little change averse, and I expect you see this in your work, that organizations which are going through rapid growth or change, that's uncomfortable. And I think there may be a perception, I would say a misperception, that change is somehow equivalent to problem, to breakage, and that's not necessarily so. Again, that's a box that we're carrying around over our heads that is limiting us in fully investigating and seeing where can this evolution take us? Where is it going on its own, let alone where could it possibly be directed? Why even direct it? Let's see it take its natural expression in our cultural context.
I would agree with that. That was another theme that came up, and I found this actually all over the place, not just at Garrison, is the idea that the evolution of Buddhism can be directed, and we should be directing it. And in this, people are falling into what's something I referred to earlier, the myth, and they've adopted the secular form of the Christian myth of salvation. And this was secularized in the 18th century, Auguste Comte was the person who put together a religion based on scientific principles. And the religion didn't survive, but the idea that we could control the evolution of humanity, control the evolution of the planet, etc., replacing salvation with the myth of progress, has become very popular and had extraordinary influence. What people don't realize is that it was that myth that was behind the atrocities in the French Revolution and went on to spawn communism, fascism, radical fundamentalism, and Al-Qaeda. Because all of these are carrying that idea to the logical extreme. We're implementing a new world. You're standing in the way of it. We have a right to get rid of you.
It's still a theological stance of directing something rather than letting it grow.
Yes. And the thing is about letting it grow is you don't get to control growth.
Right. And
which is what you were saying earlier.
Yeah, and to me that's a wonderful thing, because not only will it take forms much more beautiful and imaginative than I could possibly influence with my limited mind, it's also going to grow into places and directions and new environments, and I keep using biological terms for this sort of thing, that will be areas that others will engage with it very positively. Again, because they're different and I have a different set of experiences, I would never have imagined that. So to me, that takes a great deal of that stress off. I don't need to control this. It will go just fine entirely on its own.
And I agree with very much with what you said. And people will be hurt as things change. And here we go back to the theme that I was proposing earlier, is it's not to control the course of evolution so that nobody suffers. That actually ends up creating more problems. It's learning how to live in a world of organizations, a world that is constantly evolving, a world that is changing all the time, in a way that you don't struggle with your life.
Yes, exactly. I think that is an overriding message in our practice, is how we do that. We've been speaking with Ken McLeod, the Executive Director of Unfettered Mind. And I wanted to mention the website address is www.unfetteredmind.org. Love the subtitle of Pragmatic Buddhism on that site. And you also, for folks who are listening, I will have links to Ken's blog and also to your podcast, because you also have one that I spot when I look on iTunes, and usually the Secular Buddhist and your podcast are in the same general area on the page. So I will be linking to that as well. Ken, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time with me today.
It's been a lot of fun, and we were able to go a little deeper in this conversation, I think.
Yes, I think so too.
I'm sorry the first one was lost, but those are the kinds of things that happen. Someone just has to move on.
Them's the breaks.
But anyway, it's very good talking with you, and thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to learn more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the companion website at www.thesecularbuddhist.com, and you'll find an entire web page devoted to this and every episode. There are also links to discussions about today's topic on the Secular Buddhist Facebook fan page. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizan Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on The Secular Buddhist on the About Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.